Welcome to the Ignited Recovery Podcast, a new way forward for anyone looking for answers but feeling left out. If you've been searching for empowerment, triumph, and purpose, you've found them right here. You won't hear the same solutions, and you're not going to have any excuses to fall back on, because Ignited Recovery allows heroes to rise and become their best selves. I'm Dr. Adi Jaffe, and I can't wait to be your guide on this journey. Are you ready to become an ignited hero? Hey there, guys. We've asked whether you want to have more personal recovery stories or more science. We've also asked if you want answers to your own personal questions, and we heard you. So the team has added in a little question section to the website where you can ask us anything that you're struggling with, anything in this world of recovery and mental health that you're curious about, anything you specifically need help with or somebody near and dear to you does. All you got to do is head to ignited.com/questions, plural, ignited.com/questions, and ask us anything. I cannot wait to answer your questions. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Ignited Recovery Secrets Podcast. I'm Adi Jaffe, and I got to tell you, man, we were all celebrating here at Ignited when we were finally able to sit down with today's guest, Rick Doblin of MAPS. Rick, saying that Rick is a pioneer in the mental health and drug world is like saying that Neil Armstrong flew planes. This guy's been fighting this war that he was here to talk about since he was 18 years old. Like, longer than I've been alive, this guy has been fighting to end the war on drugs and really to kind of flip it on its head and start understanding the healing properties behind some of these psychedelics. And you're going to hear about how it is that Rick got interested in this. But I got to tell you, at a time when the work that I do is all about lifting people up who are struggling with addiction, and especially during this crazy time with the pandemic, people need this more than any time in the past that I can remember, at least. And Rick's mission is gaining in popularity, and he's done so many amazing things through MAPS, which is the organization he started. MAPS stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And if that sounds a little out there for you, imagine what it was like 40-some years ago when he started this thing, right? The idea of using psychedelics and studying them using the actual scientific method to understand what they are good for. It's more than clear to me that the world needs more and more people like Rick, which is why it was so amazing to be able to get and sit down with him. You've heard Sophie and I talk about studies that have supported the use of MDMA. They're his studies. Like, this is the guy who funded over $100 million that he's been able to get for MAPS since he started it. And it's pretty clear to me that the world needs a different way to approach addiction. I do the stuff that I do at Ignited with our Hero program and with my books and all that kind of stuff. But Rick not only flipped the concept that people don't necessarily need abstinence, he's specifically saying there are these medicines, these substances, these drugs, these psychedelics that can be used medicinally to help people. There are a lot of people in traditional recovery that have told me on the DL in secret, oh yeah, I use mushrooms, I use ayahuasca, I used X, Y, and Z, ketamine for my depression, but they can't talk to anybody about it. And that's what's so cool about this conversation with Rick. The man's amazing. He's put so much work and so much time and so much effort. And look at what happened right now in Oregon. Look at what's happening in Colorado in terms of making mushrooms legal, in terms of decriminalizing drugs. There is no way that any of that would have been done without this guy's work. And so I urge you to give him the respect, give him the time, sit down and listen to the amazing discoveries this man has come across and the viewpoint that he has. I'm not going to give it away because I want you to hear his story, but it's so cool to see what can happen to someone when they, when they get a bone in their mouth, a bone they don't want to let go, and they just run with it. This guy's changing the world. You're going to love this interview. Enjoy. Even before we kind of get into it, I want to tell you it's an honor. I've wanted to have this conversation for a long time, since I was a PhD student at UCLA, which is, man, I got that degree in 2010. So it's been over a decade that I've wanted to have this conversation. So I'm really excited that we get to do it.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
What was your dissertation on, just by the way?
Sure. So I did an animal model of interference and learning mechanisms based on dopaminergic changes in the rat brain. We did it with cocaine and nicotine is what we focused on. But,
Oh, okay.
but my joke is that, well, you don't know anything about my story, so it'll be interesting to kind of do this exploration. I was arrested for selling drugs in 2000. And my running joke is that almost all the drugs that I got caught with are now MAPS, psychedelic therapeutic drugs under consideration. And so I really wish that you guys had gotten as far as you have by now when I was facing 18 years in prison, because LSD, psilocybin, MDMA were kind of the main drugs that I was caught with. And I love the work and the dedication that you have had to this field now, for going on 40 years, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would say that one of the only reasons, or one of the main reasons that we are able to make the progress that we're making is because public attitudes have shifted. And in part, I think it's because of all the underground use of these drugs.
Yeah.
So I need to thank you for the work that you did paving the way for us and helping people have their own direct experiences. And if it weren't for the whole underground, I never would have had my own experiences. So I think that's been, and I think the drug war is, fundamentally counterproductive and immoral. And so I think
so many of those things to talk about. And I do want to talk about a little differently the recreational versus therapeutic use as it happens right now. And I know you're also a supporter of individual self-growth and exploration through these chemicals. So it's not like you're taking one side of the fence or another, but they are different and they serve different roles. And I want to be really focused on that as well. My wife isn't here with us today, but after I got out of jail, I put this in air quotes, but I sort of cleaned up my act, went back to school, got my master's and a PhD, and I was studying addiction and neuroscience, et cetera, and still am a social drinker, but didn't incorporate any other psychotherapeutics, I'll call them, into my life because there was a lot of fear. I mean, even as somebody who'd been through it, the dogma about what addiction is was still pretty strong, even in my head. And I didn't want to create this entryway. And then one day my wife comes to me. We were already married. We had one child, and she had tried MDMA when she was in high school, but she felt pretty confident that she wanted to try it again to help us overcome some intimacy issues. And she had been through sexual trauma, deep sexual trauma for years with a past partner. And I was incredibly resistant at first, if I can just be honest. To me, it was an entryway, again, like I mentioned, back into my drug dealing days and everything that happened in the interim. I'll be fully candid. I didn't know much about MAPS research at that time. I knew about my experience. I hadn't delved deeply into your work yet. I wasn't done with my PhD. And so I was really resistant. We talked about it for about 6 to 12 months before we experimented with it ourselves for the first time. And since then, it's become a handful of times a year therapeutic experience for us in a few different contexts. And the reason I want to bring it up and start here is, yes, the underground work is relevant and people experiencing these, enlightenment moments and, pseudo spiritual moments sometimes in context of some psychedelics are important. But I got to tell you that the way that I get across to so many people and make them understand why your work matters is by showing them the end result and the data on the impact these therapeutics have specifically for people who've experienced trauma. I don't want to tell that story because you're the guy. And so I'd rather have you tell the story. But you've been at this for a while. Share with us the biggest highlights you believe show you with certainty that these medications, these therapeutics need to be considered when it comes to helping people overcome PTSD and trauma.
Well, for me, I first tried MDMA in 1982. It was called Adam. which was the name for the use of it as an underground therapy drug. It was legal, but it was underground because it was kept quiet for fear that if people were to find out about it, and this was during Ronald Reagan escalation of the drug war, that then it would be made illegal. And when I found out about it in '82, it was also just starting to be sold more in public settings under the name Ecstasy. And so it was very clear that it was doomed. My first experience with it was in October of 1982, and it was that really woke me up to the therapeutic potential of it. I just thought it was incredible. The first time I ever worked with a PTSD patient, this was at a time before I really started focusing on the politics and drug development. I was trying to become a psychedelic therapist and learning about that. So in 1984, I worked with a PTSD patient who was suicidal, had just come out of a hospital to protect herself from self-harm, been raped, been almost murdered, just horrible story. And so I found in my direct experience how incredibly valuable MDMA was to treat trauma. I also was at a workshop at Esalen in Big Sur, California with Stan Groff, and there was a veteran there, and he shared that he had been shot during the war in the back and had bullet fragments still in his back, and that it caused him all this pain. And that he had had an MDMA experience, and that he was able to work on the emotions of being shot, the whole trauma of that. And as he kind of could relax from the fear and terror of that, he felt that there was a similar relaxation going around in the musculature of his back where the bullet wound was. And that he was able to get both emotional healing and physical healing, both of which lasted, had persisted.
And I think that's the important thing for people to understand, right? Look, there are drugs like alcohol. You drink a bunch of alcohol, it helps your back pain because you're numb, your feelings are depressed. It may even make you pass out. But when you wake up, any of that relief is gone. If anything, we know now it's actually the pain can be exacerbated because your brain has sort of taken a break from producing its own pain reduction chemicals. And so it's taken a break, and now you're more in pain. And we can talk about hangovers and all those other effects. Yeah. But what you're talking about is long-term change in people's psyche.
Yes. Well, we would call it fear extinction and memory reconsolidation. Also neuroplasticity. We know that psychedelics promote new neural connections. And one of the best pieces of evidence that we have, though, for this idea that there's a persisting effect in our therapy, which is 3.5 months long, basically. And people only get MDMA 3 times, once a month. And they also have 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 before the first MDMA session for preparation, for building the therapeutic alliance, and then 3 of these non-drug psychotherapy sessions for integration after each of the MDMA sessions. And then what's called the primary outcome measure, which is the measure for FDA approval, is 2 months after the last experimental session. We do that because we don't want people to say, oh, this is a psychedelic afterglow, this is something that's going to fade. So 2 months after the last MDMA session is a substantial amount of time. And if there is, quote, an afterglow effect, it would have faded by then. And so we show excellent results. And later on, I can sort of share more specifics about the results that we do get. But what I want to say is that we also do a 12-month follow-up. And the primary outcome measure at the 2-month follow-up is to compare the results with your experimental group with your control group. And that's for FDA approval. The 12-month follow-up is more for insurance companies to show, is it durable? How many people relapse? Is it something, because it's labor intensive, a lot of expense. And if it just fades, it's not going to be adopted by therapists or by the insurance company. So what we show is that people keep getting better. The results are better at the 12-month follow-up than at the 2-month follow-up. And at the 2-month follow-up, we're done. We don't do any more therapy. There's no more drugs. Now, people can do whatever they want,
Of
So
course.
some of them will do therapy, some of them will do any number of things, but some of them will do nothing. But once they've learned how to process trauma, whereas before the emotional memory was overwhelming, they couldn't handle it, they couldn't get rid of it, it would never go away. It was always about to be happening. It would come in their dreams with nightmares. It would affect their daily life in major ways. But once people learn how, when these difficult emotions come up, that instead of either being overwhelmed or suppressing them, that if you can kind of let out the feelings, you don't have to be overwhelmed. And that's what happens with the MDMA. It teaches people how to process trauma. Then people can do it on their own without the drug. And that's the key
Yeah.
point, is that it's different than SSRIs that are for PTSD, where you take it every day for years and years. This is only a few times. Get to the root of the problem, try to address the core issues, and then make people free of drugs. So that the fact that we're like a nonprofit pharma company, our goal is not to sell the most MDMA. It's to get the most people healed from their traumas and from other problems.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned so many things I want to focus on. So at Ignited, we talk a lot about shame. I wear a bracelet that says "fuck shame" on it,
Oh, nice.
and the idea is, these internalized feelings of low self-worth and separation and isolation from others in the world, and the moral sort of perception that you are not enough, etc. You mentioned the word reconsolidation, so I want to explain to people a little bit what that
Right. Yeah.
means,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
When people have these experiences, it's not just that the MDMA teaches them how to communicate, it's that all these things that come up during the experience, when they get re-remembered, which is what reconsolidation is you have a memory of a trauma or an experience, and then every time you re-experience that memory, it actually gets an opportunity to be reconsolidated, to be created again. And so MDMA forever shifts the actual internal experience of the trauma memory, right? And I think that's why it works so well long term, is it literally changes your relationship to that memory. It changes your relationship to the trauma. It actually allows you to release some of the feelings that have been associated with it. And when you do it over multiple occurrences with support, as you do in your studies, you have a guide to help you not just focus on, again, this is the difference between recreation and therapeutic experience. It's not just focus on whatever you want to focus on in the moment. It's about picking these threads that are really important for your therapeutic experience long term, and being able to have these deep processing moments. We always talk about with ecstasy or with MDMA, it's like that shame wall comes down. These things
Yeah.
that you normally would not be able to talk about are now fodder for conversation and for consideration, and you literally get to discuss and feel things you've told yourself you can't for decades sometimes.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happens is this depth of self-love. And I think a lot of it is from the oxytocin. I mean, we can have biological explanations, but if there was one word that I had to, or a hyphenated word that I had to use to describe what MDMA does, it's self-acceptance.
Yeah.
And so you accept yourself for your imperfections, for things that have happened to you, for things that you may be ashamed of, or that are shameful to talk about in certain ways. This deep and profound self-acceptance. And what that does is it kind of relaxes the inner critic that's constantly going, and it makes it so that people are better listeners. They're not so ego defended, so that they can hear what people really think. They want real, honest feedback, because they're sitting in this sort of moment of incredible self-acceptance. And so whatever you happen to say, it's okay. And
Mm.
also whatever they share. So people have been able to share the most shameful things, the most kind of terrifying things that they've done, that they've made mistakes or that have happened to them that our culture says is shameful. And people are able to accept it. And uh, to go back to the memory reconsolidation just for a moment, is that one way that we try to explain it is that there's episodic memory, which is for the memory of what happened. And then there's the emotional memory that's linked to the episode, to whatever happened.
Sure.
So what MDMA does is, by reducing the fear response in the amygdala, portion of our brain, that people can remember more of the trauma. So whereas the trauma has been so painful and the emotions linked to the memories are so difficult that we suppress the memories themselves. So when the fear goes down, the memories come back. And so people have a better understanding of what actually happened to them. And even some of the most difficult, painful moments, they can remember more. But they're looking at it from this place of self-acceptance. And there are elements of this self-acceptance that permits grieving, crying, letting out the stress and the trauma that often when it was happening, people have to focus on survival, and now they have this opportunity to let out the feelings. And so then when you reconsolidate the memory, what you're doing is you're swapping out the emotional content before from the fear. And then it's coming from this perspective of that happened to me. It's part of my story, but it's not the whole story. And also that it happened in the past and it's not always happening now. That the connectivity between the hippocampus, where we store long-term memories, and the amygdala is increased under MDMA. So people are able, when they store this memory, they've made a switch of the emotions connected to the episode. And then the next time that they remember it, it comes with, again, this sense of, I've processed it, it's in the past, it's not happening now, and I've come to my peace with it. So that's I think a big kind of biological explanation for it. And what it means practically is that people are able to go on with their lives. People that have been disabled, people have been unable to rest at night, unable to really move in the world because so much stuff triggers them and reminds them of the past trauma. So that it's remarkable. Our phase 3 study, which we just finished, had people with an average of 20 years of PTSD. We had one person, the longest one of all, was somebody who had PTSD for 63 years. And under the influence of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, he had clinically significant reductions of his PTSD symptoms. So,
and the freedom, the level of freedom that this gives people, right? Here's the thing that I think people, well, I want to say misconstrued to some extent, but this will take me back to that place that you were talking about, and I've read from your work, which is, look, self-exploration for people who feel relatively healthy and are not encumbered by severe trauma is also a positive thing, because everything that you're saying and everything you're talking about is essentially saying this: we feel trapped, shamed, put upon by these experiences we've had in our past. And they could be big T trauma, the things that everybody would understand. You got shot, you got raped, you lost a limb. I mean, big T trauma, right? And they could be, we know this can happen. You can get PTSD from repeated exposure to some small T trauma. Whatever that is, I'm not saying everybody has that version, but all of us have these experiences that weigh us down. Being bullied when you were a child in junior high, whatever. And here's this stuff that allows you, especially in the right supportive environment, to go back into the storage room of your life, rearrange the boxes, say to yourself, hey, you know what? That bullying incident that I went through in junior high that has made me feel fat, unlovable, and ugly since I was 13 and has kept me under wraps and unable to go and hang out with people and socialize because I feel less than all the time. That happened when I was 13. And those girls or those boys in junior high, they don't matter to me anymore. And I love myself. It sounds to me like such a no-brainer that something like that would be incorporated. And I think you're right. And I do want to explore this to some extent, that there's a lot less profit in it, first of all, because it's not patented anymore, right? And so that's one piece.
Right. Well, it was invented by Merck in 1912. Yeah, so it's off patent.
Yeah, it's off patent, so nobody's going to make billions with it. But then there's the other piece, and the other piece is maybe it's in the drug war era, but I think it's probably more associated with religion and puritanical values of, well, you shouldn't feel that good. Like, you shouldn't be unencumbered, right?
Well, there is some of that as well, but part of the self-acceptance is that when people are feeling so great, they tend to own it, and that guilt comes maybe later, or what's harder really is when people lose it, when the MDMA, coming down from the MDMA is very important, because your anxieties, your fears, your normal ways, your patterns start reasserting themselves. And so that's why what's really important is the integration. There is the experience, but then how do we make it so that it lasts? And there will be.
Can we go into that a little bit so people can learn about it? So you said these kind of 3-session cycles are set up in setting up and preparing for the session, having the MDMA supported session, and then the integration. Let's go a little bit more deeply into, I know the way the dosing works is you give a specific dose at the beginning of a session, and then a pickup dose or a booster dose about halfway through.
We call it a supplemental dose.
Yeah. So what do people do in the preparation for one of these, setting their intentions, etc.?
Well, the research in psychotherapy outcomes that's been done for decades and decades has identified that the most important factor in whether somebody is getting better in psychotherapy is not the kind of psychotherapy it is. It's what's called the therapeutic alliance.
Yep.
If you have this therapeutic alliance, if you have a trusting, safe relationship with the therapist, whether they do cognitive behavioral therapy or psychodynamic therapy, that's less important than that you feel safe, that you feel capable of expressing your feelings and dealing with them and supported. So the preparation meetings, so 3 90-minute meetings roughly once a week, are for building the therapeutic alliance, for the patient to understand what is MDMA, how does it work, what is this experiment like, what's the protocol like, who are your therapists, and it's for the therapist also to learn the story of the patients, so that you're building this therapeutic alliance, you're building an understanding of MDMA. And then also there's this concept that we talk about in terms of our therapeutic approach, which we have this hypothesis of the inner healing intelligence, that we prepare people for how to process during this 8-hour MDMA session. So it's with 2 therapists, usually man and a woman, like a male-female co-therapy team, but not always. And what we explain during the preparation experience is that you have your agenda, you have your intentions, you work on all of that. But once the MDMA session starts, you throw that out the window and you respond to whatever is emerging in whatever order it emerges. And one of our therapists, who is the principal investigator of our Boston site, is Bessel van der Kolk, a psychiatrist.
Oh, I love his work. Amazing.
Yeah. And so his book is The Body Keeps the Score. Yeah. And he has the Trauma Research Network. So what this means, though, is that when people have had trauma and have developed to the PTSD, it's because sometimes these memories are so difficult. A lot of times things come in the body before they become a story, so people can have body tensions, muscle tensions, things that, and so what we train people is that instead of trying to suppress symptoms, we want to exaggerate symptoms. We want to let symptoms flourish, because it's through the pain that you will find the resolution. It's not like SSRIs that block the symptoms.
We talk about this so much at Ignited, right? Leaning into the pain. Look, discomfort tolerance is a big part of living in general, but for people with trauma, it's even more extreme.
Yeah, they're just because it goes so quickly to the terror, to the fear, to what happened, and so and they can't separate out where they're at compared to when it happened in the past. So we're training people with this concept that we all know that our body knows how to heal itself. It has these self-healing mechanisms. We get a cut, it heals it, and it's below our conscious level of control. Sure. The body does it on its own. The theory then is that the mind, the psyche, has similar self-healing mechanisms that are beyond our conscious mind. And that therefore, as you give a psychedelic, Stan Grof, who is the leading psychedelic researcher, he's 89 years now. He wrote LSD Psychotherapy, and he's been my mentor and the mentor of many of the people in the psychedelic field. he has talked about how LSD is a non-specific amplifier of the unconscious. So you think about between your mind during the day and at night when we dream, there's kind of a barrier between the conscious and the unconscious mind. The barrier
Yep.
is made more permeable during dreams and also during psychedelic states, so that LSD is more of a non-specific amplifier. MDMA is a bit more specific, you could say, more positive mood, more loving, self-acceptance. But what we say is that this move from this barrier between the conscious and the unconscious mind, that we don't understand the order of it. The therapist, we don't use the word guide. We're not the guide. You're the guide. The patient is their own guide. They're unconscious. And so when things come up, either in an idea, a memory, or in body sensations, we encourage people to let that fully flourish.
Because it's a signal, right? It's a signal your brain and your body are sending you. It's like a little flag, a little flare saying, hey, pay attention to me. And so much of us, I guess I initially meant so many of us, but actually for each one of us, so much of us spends the day trying to hide and suppress those signals and just appear normal. And I'm putting that in air quotes again for those of you not watching, because that's the message we get from society is, well, don't let those things out. That's the stuff that makes you different. Try to appear as normal as possible. And then in these psychedelic experiences, those signals come out and you get to chase them.
Yeah. Now, Stan has also said something that I thought was very poetic and very beautiful, but is about this letting the symptoms flourish. He said, the full expression of an emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. Meaning that the universe is in motion, everything is changing, and trauma is like it's frozen. It's always about to happen. We can't get past it. We can't integrate it. It colors everything. So the full expression of an emotion, once you're not fighting it, once you're not suppressing it, once you've felt it fully, it will change. And the change is more in this concept of foreground and background. So for the trauma, for people who have PTSD, the trauma is the foreground. It's always happening. It's always about to happen. They're always nervous. But once you've fully experienced it, then it moves to be part of the story instead of the whole story. So it moves more into the background. It's what brought you here, but it's not what's happening at the moment.
I love it.
We encourage people to cry, to let out the fear, to shake. Some of the people in our studies have said, I don't know why they call this ecstasy. Because during the MDMA experience, they can be going through reliving horrible things and actually letting the fear out. People are shaking, they're sweating, they're just in pain, but they're able to process it. So a good touchstone for people to think about is terms of grief. Somebody has died, it's really sad, you keep it all bottled up, and that's really harmful in a sense. But once you can cry and let it out, then it changes. This full expression of your grief changes it so that you can kind of move on. And that's the kind of what happens during the preparation session.
Hey everybody, I'm interrupting this episode to talk to you a little bit about our Ignited Hero Recovery Program. When you join our community, you get over 65 hours a month of real live support from hand-picked coaches. We've got sharing groups and trauma groups and family groups, relationship focus groups for women only. We have hypnosis, breathwork, and yoga too, and we're constantly adding more options to give you more of what will make you feel better. That's what I love about our program, and that's what over 1,000 people have loved about it already, because we offer help the way people want it, not the way someone thought it should work for everybody almost 100 years ago. Our program draws on cutting-edge science and the most effective research-backed modes of healing. Ignited's mission is to help 1 million people beat their addiction and find freedom forever. It's been absolutely magical to hear from our members about the relationships that have been repaired, the struggles that have been left behind, and the literal lives that have been saved. And if you've been searching and thinking that there's nothing out there that will actually speak to you, I can't wait for you to see just how incredible Ignited can be for you. All you got to do is go to ignited.com/recovery and check it out. So I love hearing about this, because I think this is a point where Well, so the work my wife and I do with couples is primarily relationship, especially around relationship trauma. So cheating, things of that nature, right? And so there can be huge trust broken. And so the preparation there is in really trying to get them to understand how to co-relate again, how to trust each other, and reducing this wall and dropping this wall can be very helpful in that setting. But what you're saying that is really incredible is while everybody thinks of the ecstasy version of
Yeah,
MDMA, which is about connecting physically and being more free and sensual maybe for a lot of people, there is no requirement that that's the emotion that you go explore. You can go explore whatever else comes up and be more connected to it. So if it's trauma, it may involve crying, it may involve shaking, it may involve the processing of deeply troubling versus sensual and sexual kind of experiences. But the freedom that you have to explore those is the same. That's the common thread.
yeah. Yeah, for people that would like to get kind of a really good introduction to what MDMA assisted psychotherapy is, there's a tremendous documentary called Trip of Compassion, and it's available on Vimeo. And it's about 3 of the patients in our Israeli MDMA PTSD phase 2 study. It has English subtitles, and a bunch of it is in English as well.
I'm Israeli, so I'll watch it in the original Hebrew.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, it's a trip of compassion. It's a
Love it.
phenomenal. It's changed everything for us in Israel, by the way, because it's been widely shown. It was produced by Israeli Broadcast Company, and it's been shown on TV and showings all over Israel. The Israeli Ministry of Health was actually the first to approve compassionate use of MDMA. We have our phase 3 studies. We have 2 sites in Israel, 2 in Canada, and 11 throughout the United States. So we'll be able to get approval, if the data is right, from FDA, Israel, and Canada based on the phase 3 studies we're doing now. As long as you're Israeli, I'll just mention that there is another project we're doing, which is
I know.
the Israelis and Palestinians who are doing ayahuasca and MDMA together.
If you end up bringing peace between Palestine and Israel, I would. I mean, what? Oh my God! What a culmination of work, right? To bring a people together who've been neighbors for literally the last century, and have had this ongoing conflict. I think that project is really, really exciting.
Yeah, what we like to joke though is that if we can help the Israelis and Palestinians make peace, then we can work on the harder case, which is Republicans and Democrats.
especially now, that might not be a joke.
Yeah, no,
Oh, so true.
it's partially not a joke. And just one anecdote from one of the Israelis who was in one of these ayahuasca sessions. So, there's a lot of music in ayahuasca sessions, and but sometimes they will also play music. And so, because this was Israelis and Palestinians, they played some Arabic music. And one of the Israelis said that he was so tuned into hearing Arabic music and being frightened that that's the
Mm,
music of the enemy, that's something that he couldn't grasp, and it always made him scared. But hearing the Arabic music in this different state of mind made him helped him see the beauty in it,
mm,
and he could see that as um, what people all had in common, that this was that they weren't all of a sudden, here's the Jews, here's the Palestinians, here's the Arabs. It was like we're all part of this human family, and we need to figure out how to get along. And then the
yeah.
music that you've got, he could see the beauty in it.
Yeah. 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 I love it. I love it. I mean, there again,
Well,
so many uses for something that can bring people together like this.
yeah, it's actually kind of just a bigger version of couples therapy.
Right.
So and I'll say that also one of the studies that we're about to publish a paper on, which is going to come out in the next couple weeks, electronically free for open access. It's the European Journal of Psychotraumatology. It's
Mm,
a study of an approach for treating PTSD that involves the couple. So it's called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, where conjoint means couple or dyad, where one person has PTSD, but as we know, it affects any one person in a system has emotional issues. It affects everybody in the system. So,
sure.
so it's the person with PTSD and the other person in the dyad that's impacted by it. Not always a romantic partner, but usually. And they bring both people into the therapy. So it's cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. And in our work with trying to bring this into the Veterans Administration and the Department of Defense, that about 7 years ago, we were given permission to work with a VA affiliated researcher, a woman, Candace Monson, who had been in charge of women's health at the Boston VA. And she developed this cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. And because it was couples, and because people have heard about MDMA for couples therapy or romance, they thought this would be the first thing to blend MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. And it worked phenomenally. So it's both a treatment for PTSD and also couples therapy. And you can see how the relationship, through all the measures about the relationship, is strengthened by this ability for people to listen to each other speak. A lot of times the person that has PTSD doesn't realize the stress that he or she is putting on everybody around them. And they're always focused on their own problems. I mean, because
sure. Because like you mentioned, it's always in the foreground, right?
Yeah. So that Candace and I presented about 3 months ago to the Boston VA, the results of her studies with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, developing it without MDMA, all the years that she developed it. And she showed what's called effect size. So you can have statistical significance, meaning it's not from chance.
Sure.
But you can have a lot of things that are not from chance, but are small effects. Doesn't really matter that much. So the effect size is a measure. So she showed the effect sizes of all the studies that she had done to develop this new treatment approach. And then she showed the effect size when she blended it with MDMA, which was bigger than anything she'd gotten before. So
yes.
I think that this is going to be one of the most important areas of research going forward. The problem for us, because MDMA is an illegal drug, a Schedule I drug, we can medicalize things, but we can only medicalize for the treatment of diseases.
Sure.
DSM-5 diseases, and then we can get insurance coverage, and FDA will permit us potentially to use it. But couples relationships, it's not a disease. Like a midlife crisis, losing your way in life, is not necessarily a disease. It can be associated with anxiety, depression, stuff like that. But we're not going to be able to get permission from FDA to market MDMA for couples therapy.
This speaks so much to, and I love all these relevant tangent that we're going on because they are relevant. It speaks so much to the idea that people, especially in the US, but I think Westernized society in general, sort of don't look to take care of their wellness. They look to address their sickness. And so, because I'm actually very much against the medicalization of addiction itself, right? The idea that you have to give a label to somebody in order to make it okay for them to get help for that, right? Like, you can't be struggling with alcohol. That's not enough to get you support. You have to be an alcoholic or, suffering with an alcohol use disorder.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is you can't just be a couple struggling. You have to be on the verge of suicide because of the breakup of your relationship. And that could potentially be when we could bring in these therapeutics. And that also means, look, confirmation bias, expectancy bias. And that means that you're always looking for problems to fix instead of realities to improve and make better.
Well, I think that's where, in the earlier parts of our conversation, we were talking about drug policy reform and also medicalization. And so our goal at MAPS is mass mental health. And I'll say, I'm also Jewish, and it was because of the terror that I experienced as a young boy, learning secondhand from a safe position in America about the Holocaust. And, now I see what happened in America under Trump, and people's willingness to believe falsehoods and to scapegoat immigrants and others. I have tragically, I have a much better understanding of how the Nazis could take over in Germany and how something could have happened like that in America. And I had a ketamine experience and a DMT experience that was involved with the inner Hitler and the outer Hitler. And from there, I realized, though, that people like Trump, dictators, various people, that, there's a lot of people saying, let's just give MDMA and psychedelics to all the political leaders and then the world will be better. But people have to want to change. They have to want to grow. So that the real long-term solution for avoiding another Holocaust or destroying ourselves in nuclear war is mass mental health. The people that give away their power, the millions and tens of millions of the people who give away their power to dictators, they get less out of it than the dictators. And so, ironically, I think it's going to be easier to heal hundreds of millions of people than it is to take dictators and authoritarians and people who manipulate others by fear and hatred to change them. So what that means is that we need a dual strategy. One is medicalization to change cultural attitudes and to deal with the war, and the other is drug policy reform. So MAPS has raised over $100 million in donations in our history, which is an astonishing amount of money.
Yeah.
But we don't owe anything to investors. So one of the things that we're able to do is support drug policy reform so people could get access to MDMA without having to get it from us. We want a licensed legalization system whereby adults have an experience with psychedelics under supervision in a psychedelic clinic, then they get a license to buy it on their own. If they misbehave, they get punished for their misbehavior, and then they lose their license for a while. So that's the ultimate system. But I think we need embedded in our culture mainstream access to psychedelics that are pure, with honest drug education, with harm reduction, with treatment on demand. And then we also need this parallel route, which is medicalization, where it's covered by insurance for all the therapists.
Yeah, I mean, and look, a couple of things. First of all, for anybody who doesn't know, Oregon just passed laws essentially decriminalizing, which is one step closer to either legalizing or creating some licensure sort of procedure, but at least takes it out of the criminal justice system to the best of their abilities, because it's not federally affecting, it doesn't affect any federal laws, it just affects state laws. But they just decriminalize all drugs, right? And so that's an important step, kind of following the Portugal model.
Yeah.
And along with what you're saying, I got to say this. So I didn't talk about the level of this, but in those days when I was using heavily and selling MDMA, I've definitely sold upwards of 250 to 300,000 ecstasy pills, because we also operated in volume, and I would sell thousands and tens of thousands of pills to some people. So maybe even up to 500,000. I'm not really sure. I've never really kept track of the number, but like when I got arrested, there were 10,000 pills that were there. Right. And so, but I got to tell everybody who's paying attention right now. So I knew thousands of ecstasy users over the 5-6 years that I sold. And I've never met anybody addicted to this stuff. And the reason, and this is an important thing for people to point out, because everybody's always focusing first and foremost on, but people get addicted to the drug. And here, the pattern that I saw recreationally, right? This was not within a therapeutic community sort of, or clinical setting. When people would first take it, they would have this magnificent experience. I mean, almost everybody, not everybody. Sometimes you have an off reaction to the medication, to the drug, but most people would have this enlightenment experience, saying, "Oh my God, I didn't even know I could feel this way," which is why the term ecstasy was so relevant to me back in those days. And then a subset of those people would continue and take it periodically and enjoy it. And another subset, a substantial subset, would go all in on MDMA. They would do it almost every weekend, sometimes a couple of times a week, for a handful of months. And it would seem like it's developing this addictive potential. And they would go in and they would do these ceremonies, but essentially party drug experiences. And then within a few months, 3-4 months, they would start weaning off of it. And the frequency of using it would get reduced substantially and relatively quickly, because it's almost as if the job of the drug was done, right? The release that they had received from their experiences was so prevalent now that the difference between what they felt like when they were not on MDMA and what they felt like they were on didn't seem substantial enough to go through the experience. And I think that's really important for people to hear. Even when you take this stuff recreationally, oftentimes not everybody, and I'm not recommending you go take ecstasy and blah, 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 right? All those disclaimers. But even when you take it recreationally, it has this effect that lasts far beyond the experiences you have and becomes this open portal to understanding people a little bit differently, understanding yourself differently. And I think that's something a lot of people in our current modern society could use, right? That shift in perspective from this is the truth, what I see and what I've always seen in my life is the truth, to, oh, wait, there are other ways to perceive myself and those around me.
Yeah, I mean, people have long-term dependent relationships with alcohol or nicotine or opiates or cocaine, but you don't really see that with MDMA, that it tends to fade over time. I have known people that have done it an awful lot for like a year, more than a few months, but then it doesn't work as much for them anymore. And the thing about it is that a lot of these drugs that people get addicted to, once you develop this sort of tolerance to it, the next step is just take larger and larger doses. But when you do that with MDMA, you get more of the speedy effects. You don't get the
Yeah.
open-heartedness. So people on their own sort of diminish their use of it. So it's got I would say, not a high potential for addiction. And there was a recent study, a psychiatrist in England, Ben Sessa, did a study with alcoholics with MDMA. And so they were detoxed, and then within 2 weeks, they would start the study. And what he showed is that if you help people process trauma, a lot of what is really leading towards people excessively using drugs is that they're running away from their emotions. They're running away from trauma, from difficult emotions, and they're trying to make it so that alcohol or whatever drug they're using is replaces these anxiety feelings. So if you have somebody that has that addiction pattern in the past, and then you help them process their traumas, there's less of a desire to go back and run away from your problems because you've now learned how to handle your problems in a different way. So I think MDMA will be, as we go into the future, one of the very important tools for the treatment of addiction. Instead of being an addictive drug, and we do show that people in our studies, diminish their use of alcohol and other substances, that the MDMA helps them to process difficult emotions and loving emotions as well, and that they don't need to run away as well.
Exactly. And I think that speaks heavily to that shame component we were talking about earlier, which is we have to stop focusing. And this is why the drug war has been so ineffective. It got started during the Nixon era, et cetera, because the idea was there's something evil about these drugs and we have to make people not use them. And that's a complete misconception. Or there's something bad about the people who are using them and we need to put them in jail.
That is it. That is really it. So
and we need to put them in jail, yeah.
I mean, do you know about the Ehrlichman quote, the John Ehrlichman quote? So Ehrlichman was Nixon's domestic policy advisor. And so near the end of the 70s, after the drug war had been ramped up and the war on drugs and all this, what Ehrlichman said was that the Nixon White House had two major enemies. One was the hippies who were, protesting the Vietnam War and all that. The other was the civil rights movement.
Civil rights movement, yeah.
And so what Ehrlichman said is we knew that we couldn't criminalize their protests, but we could criminalize the drugs that they were using. And we could use the drug war to arrest their leaders, to break up their meetings, to put people in jail and to harass them. And did we know that we were exaggerating the risks of these drugs? Of course we did. Mm. So this was, I think it's a very important understanding that the drug war has never been about reducing drug abuse as its primary motive. It's been about persecuting minorities and using the drug war as an excuse to do so, or it's been about money making for private prisons, for prison guards, for police, for the DARE program. It's been these different kind of incentives, but it's never really been about reducing drug abuse, and it has totally failed at reducing drug abuse. If you look at
and decimated populations.
Yeah. So I think we are, as a culture, 50 years after 1970, the Controlled Substances Act, finally getting disillusioned about the war on drugs and the stigma about drugs. I mean, medical marijuana and marijuana legalization is happening all over the place, and there's a lot more appreciation for psychedelics. So I think that we are at an incredible moment in history where we have the chance, after 50 years where the backlash came for psychedelics, I think we can succeed now in integrating psychedelics into our culture if we do it in a careful way without generating another backlash. And I think that what that will mean practically is that 2022, the end of it, or early 2023, we should have FDA approval for the prescription use of MDMA. This is if our data keeps coming out as it does. Other groups will come near the end of 2023, 2024 to make psilocybin into medicines federally. Ketamine is already used for the treatment of depression, and there are hundreds of ketamine clinics all over America. So we will end up having thousands and thousands and thousands of psychedelic therapy clinics. And the therapists all want to be cross-trained into MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, 5-MeO-DMT, all these different things. And we will have hundreds of thousands of people that will, or more even, that will have benefited from psychedelic therapy. And those stories will permeate the culture. And then we will eventually move into a post-prohibition licensed legalization system.
Yeah, we'll probably need some younger people in congressional and and top level sort of political roles across our state and federal agencies. But yes,
well, we will, and that's definitely happening. But we also are going to benefit from. I think Biden has learned a lot about the mistakes that he made in terms of ramping up the drug war. So you didn't mention this, but I'll just mention it. But because in part of Biden's work and others, if you're caught with an equivalent amount of MDMA in one hand or cocaine in the other, you will go to jail longer for the MDMA than for the cocaine. The sentencing guidelines are so warped because of the fears that were exaggerated about MDMA brain damage and neurotoxicity and all of this that it's completely out of whack and irrational.
I love it. Yeah. And again, all those things need to be examined and just I think public opinion is a huge court where a lot of this will take place. And as more states decriminalize substances in general, people will stop having this irrational fear response prior to examination, right? Before having any experience with it. I really adore the work you guys do. I'm so, I tell the people I work with all the time that persistence will get you much, much farther than intelligence, talent, wherewithal, innate ability. And you've done all of it, right? So you started focusing on this early. You stuck to it. You went and got the education to know and be able to speak intelligently about these, so that you're not, so you're not considered one of those hippies who's just trying to promote drugs. And you have stuck to this, man. I mean, literally coming up on 40 years. So
it's actually 48 years now. It was when I was 18 in 1972 that I decided to focus on psychedelics. It took me a while to get integrated enough to really make it as the foreground, but it was really 48 years that I've been on this. And I think that what's happened to keep me going, I've had dreams of Holocaust survivors who one in particular survived miraculously survived when everybody around him was killed, and he felt that he was survived for a reason, but he didn't know what the reason was. And in the dream, I was with him on his deathbed, and he said, "Now I know what the reason is." And I said, "What?" He said, "It's to tell you to study psychedelics." And I sort of took that on, and then he died in front of my eyes in this dream. But it's really this political sense, two parts. One part is all the traumas that are filters through which we see the world, all the different ways that we don't see the world for it really it is. It's warped by our past histories, and so to try to cleanse that is one thing. The other is the mystical unitive sense that people get from more classic psychedelics, but also comes from MDMA, where you feel that we're all part of one system. And now we see more and more of that happening from the astronauts. When you look back at the Earth from space, they see look, it's part of one system, and you don't see the religions, you don't see the borders. It's, and it's clear you don't see the separation between people and nature either, and for the environmental destruction that we're doing. So
Yeah.
I think that those kind of implications, if we can have more people have these experiences, I think it'll make it for a better world. And I like to think of myself as just a fuck up who just keeps on trying. But as far as the persistence, you have a vision, you make new mistakes all the time, but you just keep at it, and eventually things can work out.
Yeah, $100 million in, I think you're doing something right. I just had this thought, and I don't know if this will take us on too long of a tangent, but
because I unfortunately I do have a board of directors meeting that starts in a minute.
In 1 minute. In 1 minute. So here's my entryway to the relationship way of doing this work, and that is, so many women have been sexually assaulted, traumatized, and affected. And if we can do this conjoint therapy to help the women who are struggling with the trauma, that could be the entryway into the medicalization and of therapeutic relationship-based work, because oftentimes it's that past sexual experience that can be so traumatizing and problematic for developing intimacy.
That's so right. And I for political reasons in America, the veterans in our studies get most of the attention. But over 60% of the people in our studies are women who've been sexually abused or domestic violence.
Sure.
So really, that's where the bulk of the trauma is located in the world, not just in America, is in women. And it's not, there's a lot of boys and young men that have been sexually abused as well. But it's tragic. And the amount of pain and suffering that humans are carrying. We're also working with this woman, Rachel Yehuda, who's a researcher at the Bronx VA, and she's done studies in what's called epigenetics, which is so it's how trauma is passed from generation to generation. And
expresses itself even in one person throughout their life, right? By changing your blueprint's expression. Yeah, and she's done work with Holocaust survivors and their children and identified biological medicine. So epigenetics is what turns on the genes. Genetic evolution is very, very slow and depends on mutations, but you can in your lifetime have changes that turn on or turn off certain genes, and that's the most amazing part. And so I love it. There's so much hope. Rick, thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for the work that you've been doing for these 50 years, because it's made a huge difference. Secondly, for the incredible impact that you're having as we speak right now through all these studies and pushing these through to phase 3 trials is no joke for anybody who doesn't understand what that process is like. Maybe we get to connect in the future. I hope we do. This has been really enlightening, and I know everybody will really, really appreciate it. We'll put links to all your stuff, and I think I mentioned this to you before, but I really want our Ignited program that deals primarily with addiction to find a way to interact and provide some monetary benefits to MAPS over time so that you guys can continue doing your work. That would be great. And I just will mention Ibogaine as well, that we're interested 100%. In for opiate addiction. So there's so much to do in the field of addiction. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rick. Everybody here, just go follow the links, follow what MAPS is doing. It's incredible, incredible work. Thank you again, Rick. Have a great rest of your day. Okay, great. Bye. Thank you for tuning in to the Ignited Heroes Recovery Podcast. I really hope you found the information here useful, and that we'll see you back here next week. And look, I want to make sure that this podcast is the most useful it can be for you, so please let me know by emailing info@ignited.com if there are any specific topics or questions you'd like to have addressed. As usual, if you like this episode, I would love for you to leave us a 5-star review and rating. Thanks, and see you next week.